So please welcome Lea Chatham.
And on that note, I just want to do a few shameless plugs that are not just for this book, but some other really amazing projects that are going on, because I do spend a fair amount of my time kind of helping support some of that stuff. So I would love to introduce you to Todd, who is the author of Jim Harrison's upcoming biography, which is going to be coming out in November. And I want to give a shout out to Jamie, who's where are you? So Godine Press is going to be releasing a Clark City Press reader. That's also going to come out in the fall. It's a collection that's been put together largely by Jamie with some help from Sally Epps, who also worked at Clark City Press. It's a really beautiful book. And there will be events for both of those things here. So I'm really proud to have supported that and helped with those projects, and excited to see them come out in the fall. And hopefully all of you will come back and support those projects too. So I first, before we get started, just want to quickly introduce the person who made this happen and let him just tell his quick story about how it came about. We really wanted to republish Dark Waters because it was one of the things that my dad had been trying to do for a number of years. He was really pretty passionate about trying to make Dark Waters happen again, and just wasn't quite able to do that because, I know not everybody knows this, but because he had frontal temporal lobe dementia for the last several years of his life, it was hard for him to finish projects. So as much as he wanted to be able to do that, it just wasn't possible. And we were approached by some other publishers, and projects fell through over and over again. And then one day, Andrea connected me with Steve Semken from Ice Cube Press, and it came together in about 5 minutes. And he's here tonight, so I do want to give him just a minute to come up and kind of say why and introduce himself.
Well, you can hear me in the back, I hope. Well, first off, I'm just going to start out by thanking all of you for being here, and for Elk River Books for hosting us, because without all of you and all of your interest, we wouldn't have no reason to be here. Well, I've been running the Ice Cube Press since 1991 out of Iowa, and I started in Kansas. And so if I were you right now, I'd be like, why is this guy from Iowa standing here right now talking to me? Well, it started like this. I'm just going to tell you a real quick history of how it is I came to this moment today. And once you explained that he always wanted it republished, I'm like, man, I'm so glad we did this. Well, I was in Kansas City, and I was walking through this bookstore, and I saw this book called Dark Waters. And I had no idea who the author was, and I flipped through, and I saw this picture of Richard Brodigan fishing on Armstrong's Creek. And I was like, well, I love Richard Brodigan, so I just bought the book. And I got home, and I started flipping through it, and then I saw a picture of Jim Harrison in there too, and I thought, what is going on here? I don't know why all these people are in this same book. And I started reading it, and by the time I was done, I had a new favorite author, Russell Chatham. And I kind of followed along with Clark City Press along the way, and not super closely. And then I was listening to Tom Rosenbauer's podcast, this Orbis podcast, and they were talking about their favorite writing on fly fishing. And they were going through the list, and A River Runs Through It was on there, and they kept going, and then they said, oh, one of their favorites was Dark Waters. And I was like, yeah, I have that book. And then they slowed me down, and they said, well, it's out of print now. And I thought, that is unbelievable to me. That is such a good book. So I went and found it on my shelf and looked at it and studied it some, and tried to look for who might have the rights to it, and I couldn't find it. Well, I wasn't following Clark City Press quite close enough, because I discovered they weren't in business anymore. And so then I had actually, Andrea was in a book I published along Andrea Peacock a while ago on fracking. And so I emailed her and asked if she had any ideas on how I could get Dark Waters to happen again. And she passed along Lea's email, and like she said, I was ready to roll. Like, I cut the spine off the copy I had, and we didn't have files for it. And so it's surprising, really, how hard it is to replicate a book, word for word, comma for comma, line for line. And I was like, that was a pretty weird decision you made on that page right there, Russ. But I kept it. Actually, it's really well designed. I just realized I was kind of entering his mind. And so that's all just a long way of saying I'm just really amazed to be standing here. And I started thinking about just like the life of books and how amazing it is that I found this book one day in 1990 maybe in Kansas, and I read it, and I was enamored by the writing and the people in it most of all. And then to just connect with some of the people here tonight. And I just think that's sort of proof of what it is to write books and how we can share our stories and how we can all stay together and make this world make a whole lot more sense to each other in a way. So anyway, thanks for being here. We've got a great speakers coming up.
Thank you, Steve, and thanks for making this happen, because it really did come together amazingly fast, I'm not going to lie. And I realize these are not my glasses, so give me a second while I get my glasses, which I regularly do. I get in the car, I get out of the car, I take my glasses, do this, and then I go in to go back to work with my computer, and I do that, and then I realize those are not my glasses. Because I'm old. And this book, frankly, is sort of to some degree, a little bit of a reflection of the story of my life. Because this book came out when I was a teenager. And so the stories in it really kind of reflect my life here. To get myself to stop crying, I'm going to tell a funny story. So, speaking of a lot of the things in this book, which is dedicated to Jim and Tom and Guy, the one story that never seems to show up anywhere is a story that was told to me by the person who I think is probably the most underrated author of Park County, which is Gatz Yortzberg, who is truly one of the most underrated persons. And one day he and I were sitting together, and I said, hey, why don't you, and nobody's ever really told me the story about how you guys all became friends. And in Gatz's way, that's so brilliant and so funny and so interesting and riveting in every story he ever told. And if you haven't read his books, I highly recommend that you get some. In particular, Fallen Angel, which is worth reading even if you've seen the movie. So he said to me, well, Tom and I were going to school at Stanford, and we both like to fish. We're fly fishermen. And we started seeing all these articles by this guy, Russell Chatham. And he was writing in Sports Illustrated and Great Sporting Journal and Esquire and all these publications. And we just really wanted to meet him. And we found out that he was in Marin. So, they're down in Palo Alto. They're like an hour and a half away. They're going to go see if they can try to track him down. And in this journey of going to find him, they're talking about what they think he might be like. And the vision they have is of a retired British Army colonel who has moved to California for the wonderful steelhead fishing of the northern rivers, and will likely be smoking a pipe with some kind of hat and a cane, drinking scotch, at the bar. And so they drive up, they hear he's in Bolinas, and they drive up there. And Bolinas, if you haven't been there, is this very small town, being like 5 buildings or something. It's very small. And my mom and dad are living above a bar, right? Something like that, upstairs. And they start walking around the town and asking people, does anybody know this guy? And somebody says, oh yeah, there's like a thing going. Now, he said a Black Panther rally. I I don't think it really was a Black Panther rally, but maybe it was. Oh, it was. She says it was. So somebody in this little dinky town in Marin County says, oh, he's at this Black Panther rally party. And they're like, well, that's weird. Because in their mind, he's like 70-something years old and he walks with a cane and wears a hat and smokes a pipe. So they head over to where this party is and they get there and they start asking around and somebody says, oh yeah, that's him over there. And Tom and Gats look over and look at each other and they go, well shit, he's just like us. Thus, the beginning of the end, I think, is the moral of that story. So I just, from day one, I think he was kind of this linchpin person of this group. And as that group expanded over time and, they became friends with Jim and Jimmy Buffett and kind of the whole Gee and the whole group. Really, he was kind of always the cornerstone person. And maybe because he was the person who could do all the things, more things than anyone else. And just for a sample of that, I will tell you, my dad was a phenomenal basketball player. I mean, like a one-shot wonder kind of basketball player. He was a phenomenal pool player. He was blind in one eye. One time when I went to the eye doctor, Jamie Barney said, do you want to know what it's like to be your dad? And I said, yeah, that's cool. So he shut off the depth perception. And he said, that is the way your dad sees the world. He has no depth perception. And yet, somehow, his brain has adjusted to not only be able to paint some of the most beautiful paintings in the world, but to be able to strike a fish at 200 feet or hit a bank shot with a pool cue in the dark and make it in the corner pocket and play basketball and shoot a pine cone, from 100 yards away. His brain was just wired differently, and in that way, he could connect with all kinds of people. He could connect with all of the fishermen from any kind of background, from anywhere in the world. And all of the young artists who wanted to come and talk to him and learn from him and all those things. And all of his friends who were writers, and all the chefs and the restaurateurs, and all the regular everyday people, like Harlan from the 6th Street Conoco, whose daughter stopped me one day to say, Harlan, who used to say to me, I love your coiffure today. His daughter stopped me one day at an event. She said, I've always wanted to come talk to you because we have this huge painting your dad painted and gave us when he died, and it says on the bottom, in memorial of Harlan, one of my best friends. He was just unique in that way, and in the way he could connect with people. And he certainly wasn't perfect, and he had his flaws, and, as a dad, I will say it was 50-50. But also, I'm the only one of his children who lived alone with him ever. And I did so several times over the course of my life. And I feel like I knew him pretty well. And for all his flaws, he was a very special person. And I think truly unique in all the world. So, that all said, Terry McDonald could not be with us because he's having a little bit of a health thing right now, and he's very sad to not be able to be here. And I think all of us who know Terry McDonald are also sad that he's not here because he truly is one of my favorite people in the whole world. And so I'm going to read Terry's foreword, and then I will hand it off for a little bit from Stephen Collector and Rick Bass, who both knew Dad for many, many, many years, and both have their own thoughts and feelings and little pieces they'd like to share. And we will try not to go too much over, but I'm sure we're already heading in that direction. So you'll just have to forgive me. Okay. So this is Terry McDonald's A Reintroduction to Dark Waters. Russell Chatham showed up unannounced with a pretty girl in a vintage Cadillac he had driven from Montana. It was 1977, and he'd come to talk about contributing to Outside. Is Tim here? Because I would give a shout out to Tim Cahill for being one of the geniuses who founded Outside Magazine. And also one of my favorite people who used to play ping pong with me up in the studio almost every day when I was a kid. Which we were launching out of the Rolling Stone offices in San Francisco. Tom McGuane had told Russell about the new magazine, and he had some ideas. At his suggestion, we went across the street for a drink at a dive bar called Jerry's. He never mentioned his painting. Russell was there as a writer, having already published outdoor pieces in Sports Illustrated. His first book, The Angler's Coast, a collection of his fishing stories set in the Pacific Northwest, had come out the previous year, and he had two more on the way, Striped Bass on the Fly, A Guide to California Waters, and Silent Seasons, 21 Fishing Stories, an anthology of pieces from 5 celebrated writers who also happened to be his fishing buddies. Interesting, I thought, and we had more than a couple of drinks that afternoon. I could not have guessed that Russell would contribute to every magazine I edited for the next 4 decades. Russell had moved to Livingston, Montana after visiting Tom McGuane. They had met in Molinas when Tom was a Stegner Fellow at Stanford, and Russell was mostly just fishing the coastal waters. They started fishing together, but what we now understand as gentrification was already beginning in Marin. Livingston was still a cattle and railroad town on the Yellowstone River at the bottom of the appropriately named Paradise Valley, if you were a sportsman. Tom had moved to the Raw Deal Ranch outside of town on Deep Creek to avoid his hunting and fishing being expeditionary. Russell was still looking for a place to make art with limited living expenses and found a place at the top of Deep Creek. Russell told me he was living on $1,000 a year, and that's true. Just want you all to know. Good job, Mom. That woman had a garden. I mean, no joke. Crazy number, but I believed him once I understood that the locals had a fine-tuned barter economy evolved from the Old West, trading commodities and services. Meat for hay or water rights, horse breaking for tractor repairs and a TV. Russell engineered a subsistence variation of his own, dental care for a small oil, winter vegetables and a load of firewood wood for a large landscape, maybe with a 12-gauge thrown in. Livingston was like that then, and many farmers enjoyed Russell's muted evocations of the surrounding mountains hanging in their kitchen. Russell was appreciated as a good neighbor and a wonderful painter. Nobody thought of him as a writer, but since his early 20s, he had been working on his writing as well as his painting, especially after he got to Montana, where his best friends were serious writers. The dedication in Dark Waters is for Tom, Jim, and Guy. Tom McGuane and Jim West Harrison, both recognized early in their careers as significant talents. Guy was Guy Winston de Guillard de la Valden, the writer and filmmaker's scion of an aristocratic family with industrial wealth. Tom introduced Russell to Jim and Guy, and the 4 of them started fishing together in Key West in the late 60s and early 70s. The other 3 chipping in to cover Russell's airfare. It's true. They mastered tarpon and permit on the fly by day and lived hard by night. Guy made a documentary about that life called Tarpon with a score by Jimmy Buffett before Margaritaville. Some of you may have seen that when it played here in town recently. Writers that they were, they talked about books, writing, and other writers. None of Russell's friends took a pencil to any of his copy, but they encouraged him, reading whatever he asked them to read, and suggesting what he might read next. The importance of this was distinct, but none of them ever talked about it. Russell was self-taught, both as a writer and a painter. Hanging in his Deep Creek house was a landscape by his grandfather, Bernardo Piazzoni, who also painted 14 unforgettable panels that now hang in their own room at the De Young in San Francisco. As a boy, Russell spent summers barefoot at his grandfather's ranch in Carmel Valley, becoming increasingly interested in painting, but there were no lessons. Days on the water with Tom, Jim, and Guy were grown up, barefoot, and immersive in the same way. Russ came to live in his writing, and he lived in his painting. In his eloquent introduction in the 1988 first edition of Dark Waters, Russell's friend and publishing collaborator Nick Lyons recounted a conversation with a then popular outdoor writer who was outraged by Russell's references to sex in his stories. Too bad, Lyons told the writer. Whatever Russell included in his writing made everything better, like the eccentric ingredients of the tasty stew Mark Twain described at the beginning of Huckleberry Finn. That seems to me a concise description of Dark Waters in general, and these stories in particular. For my money, as Russell would say when he was going to tell you something important, the first piece in the book, The Great Duck Misunderstanding, has it all. The natural world, historical context, deep knowledge, shotguns, oysters, trout, duck recipes, and a naked woman with a green parrot on her shoulder who weaves Russell into a cocoon of sexual heat that stupefied him for weeks. You'll see. Friends made a kind of flyer poster on the occasion of Russell's 40th birthday, headlined, "What Russell Does with His Money." Number 1 on the list, gifts to girlfriends. Women liked Russell, although he was not a handsome man in any traditional sense. The best description of him was Tom McGuane's in an Esquire story that pointed out one blind eye and a nose too crooked to line up a shot at a pool table, and that Russell often wore a huge snot green sweater that you might associate with the kind of people who rob lobster pots or who drive unheated taxis in Vancouver pointing out Chinamen to tourists. Good job, Mom. She knitted that sweater. She did. The rich and famous that Russell started meeting through Tom and Jim didn't care about his nose or his sweater. Many became enthusiastic collectors. Movie people like Jack Nicholson and Harrison Ford, as the circle widened to include entrepreneurs, including Yvonne Chouinard and Microsoft co-founder Paul Allen. Russell's many patrons collected his books as well as his art. All of his writer and journalist friends, from Tom Brokaw to Peter Matheson to Hunter Thompson, owned paintings too, mostly gifts from Russell. He had become a double-barreled threat on the literary scene. His paintings on the cover of Harrison's novels somehow communicated the power of writing itself. I am thinking here of Legends of the Fall, and how the cover painting, courtesy of Harry Dean Stanton, triggered a small but satisfying recognition. They were just that cool. Jim, Harry Dean, and Russell. That nuance is there too in all the pieces of Dark Waters, echoing his painting, or perhaps the other way around. They are bold, evocative, and there is also a sweet sadness shining through the ethics of a man who writes in Sporting Deaths that when he was 10 or 11 and on a walk with his 22, I saw a cottontail rabbit dash into a thicket. I looked in and saw him sitting there, looking back at me. His innocence occurred to me as I shot him point blank. Too ashamed to admit what I'd done, and stunned by the cruelty, I left the rabbit there, walked home, and put the gun away for many years. At the same time, Dark Waters is laced with sly irony and big laughs. Comparing trout fishing in Montana to what Russell finds in New Zealand, you're talking about the 5 waitresses at Martin's up against a crowded Sunday at the Playboy Mansion. Writing about fishing and bird hunting also meant writing about food, drink, and the dangers of too much good life. Eating Around finds Russell remembering that about 4 in the morning I had a beer, some salami and Japanese crackers, 2 Alka-Seltzer in the beer, a tranquilizer and a codeine tablet, and a bufferin. Before passing out, I recall being pleased to have survived. Yeah. Writing about fishing and bird hunting also meant writing about the complexities of friendship. Dust to Dust begins with the suicide of Russell's friend and hunting partner, Richard Rodigan, author of Trout Fishing in America, which mixed postmodernism with a kind of hippie magical realism that sold over 4 million copies. Russell explores so many channels in the confluence of hunting and masculinity that your head spins. The piece ends with the revelation that Richard accidentally shot and killed his best friend while pheasant hunting. The thing is, though, every piece in Dark Waters brings its own surprises. Here is the lead from Pumping Irony. The first light of dawn was beginning to show over the grassy ridges, summer yellow even in the morning darkness, when I entered another kind of gloom, Fog pushing up the canyon from Bolinas Lagoon, threading its way among the eucalyptus groves, diffusing details, making the road wet and shiny. Like re-entering a more silvery night, the fog was a silent dream, a promise of solitude. Think about it. Dark Waters is of another time, but there is no painter who can write like that, and certainly no writer who can paint like Russell. There never was. So I'll just say that before I hand it over to the next person who will probably also cry. On one of those trips to Key West, Becky Fonda once said to me, "Your dad dropped you off and asked me to babysit, and then he came back 10 days later." All right, so I'm going to hand it off. I'm really thrilled that we have Stephen Collector and Rick Bass here with us. Both of them, like I said, have known Dad for a long time. Both of them had books that Dad worked on with them and published at Clark City Press. And Stephen is going to come up and just share some thoughts that he has about his relationship with Dad and the work they did together. And then we'll have another little minute, and I'll introduce Rick. Come on.
Wow, give it up for Lea Chatham. I need my wine. So, before I get going here, I'd like to ask a show of hands of how many people in the audience knew Russ. Wow, what an audience. I'll probably never see an audience like this again, and I'm honored to be here. You know, I was thinking about this event and how sweet it is, and I'm thankful to Russ and Steve Semken to stand up here before you. And at the same time, it's a bitter feeling to stand in front of you because Russ meant a great deal to me, and I adored him. And there'll never be anybody like this guy again. And before I get going, I had this crazy thought. I thought, is it even possible that Russ, in spirit, could be in this room right now, listening and seeing all of you here with us tonight? And I can't say definitively whether that's true or not, but I've been thinking about it for weeks. And I'm hoping, Russ, wherever you are, that you're here with your daughter and your friends and your compadres from Livingston this evening. So, on a hot day in San Francisco in 2017, in the front seat of a parked pickup, April Voke interviewed Russell Chatham for the podcast Anchored. In that interview, Chatham said, around 1980, the kind of stories that I like to write were just stories. And I never told anyone how to fish or where to fish or how to tie on his or her leader. The market for that petered out around this time. Sports Illustrated no longer wanted to buy freelance work. The standard hook and bullet magazines wanted you to tell the people how and where to fish. I couldn't do it. It was simply too boring. I made a vow that I would never do anything but paint again. I'd never take a shit job, and I told my wife, Mary, we're liable to be pretty poor, and I'm just letting you know that things could get a little thin here. And they did too, but she didn't care. She got it. It's always great to be up here in the Paradise Valley, to see some faces of some longtime friends and acquaintances. And I'm honored to say a few words about the reissue of Russ Chatham's special collection of essays, Dark Waters, and share some thoughts, mostly cribbed from a profile I wrote in the last issue of American Angler in July of 2020, titled Russell Chatham, the Writer. But before I get going, I should probably say, as a photographer, that the definition of a professional photographer is simply a person who has at least 5 cameras, and a spouse who works 2 jobs. Exactly. So in 1971, seeking an affordable place to paint, and with the assistance of his new fishing friend Tom McGuane, Chatham moved to an affordable ranch south of Livingston, seeking what he called remoteness. It was in Montana that he began to write seriously. And for the next decade, rather than paint, Chatham made his living as a writer, penning stories for many of the magazines that Lea has already spoken of. From the introduction to the Angler's Coast, McGuane wrote, Russell Chatham's unfocused sense of alarm and abrupt changes of direction leaves, in one volume, fish, fisherman, and reader in a state of deep confusion. What is it that he wants? In an email after Chatham passed, McGuane said about his longtime pal, I've had moments thinking he wrote better than he painted. You can still experience his special self in those words. And as you no doubt know, Chatham had one of the most astounding ascents, and then later monetary descents in a career I've ever witnessed. I first met him at his peak, that was back in Key West, and then witnessed a flood tide of lows. It isn't a stretch to say the arc of Chatham's career mirrors the human condition, I'm afraid. And after writing an email where I acknowledged his many achievements, at the same time sensing his darkness after a series of catastrophes that have been well chronicled, in 2012 he replied, Dear Steve, thanks for the note. I've always been different. I've known that since I was 7 or 8 years old. It was reinforced all through my teens, 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s. And now, at 72, I am perhaps at last fully aware that this is a large part of the source of my staying power and refusal to be swayed this way or that by fashion or fortune. Also, I've been protected all my life by some tremendous force in the universe which saw me through many risky and stupid behaviors. So I stuck to my guns because I had to, and could never veer off the path, at least not for long. And now, after having been tarred and feathered and dragged unceremoniously down Main Street at high noon on the 4th of July, I'm back on my feet, plunging headlong into a massive reinvention of myself. Until quite recently, I thought this was an impossibility, and now I see it as a thrilling challenge. So thanks again for your encouraging words. They're in the mix somewhere. Best regards, Russ. Chatham and I stayed connected for 30 plus years. I'd see him in Livingston or bump into him at an art gallery opening in Aspen or a wild game dinner in Denver. We exchanged letters, traded art, spoke on the phone, and once he moved back to California, I made it a point to stay in touch. In some ways, I saw him as a sorcerer. He conjured images in paint and words. What initially drew me to Chatham's prose was his keen appreciation of the natural world. His knowledge of fishing and hunting was profound, but there was something else on another plane, beneath the surface. Not only a painter's sensitivity to light, but also a nuanced emotional awareness that seemed to be boundless. Chatham's writing career didn't happen overnight. Tom Wood, an artist from Marin County and Russell's first cousin, shared a few recollections in an email to help me understand his origins as a writer. Russ and I, along with my dad, Phil, fished all the time. We pored over Ted Trueblood, A.J. McLean, H.G. Tapley. Somewhere, I even have a manuscript of one of Russ's earliest stories he sent to Field and Stream in his teens, it was rejected. When we were teenagers, we both began to write accounts of our angling adventures, but only Russ persisted to become a serious and successful writer. As a photographer based in the West, I admired him. To be able to live and work in a magical mountain valley, paradise no less, on the bank of a fabled trout stream spilling out of America's greatest national park, far from the big city gatekeepers, and to make it nationally was nothing short of astonishing. While I had fine art aspirations, my career, such as it is, was a long series of compromises. On the other hand, Chatham's, from my perspective down in Colorado, appeared mythic. I looked up to him for many reasons. His body of work, his wonderful stories, a life full of sporting endeavors, but maybe most of all, for never having kissed one undeserving ass. Here, here. I don't know about you folks, but I can't say that. Not by a long shot. Speaking of which, Rick Bass's long self-made writing career, who's going to entertain you next, mirrors Chatham's success, actually, come to think about it. A mighty impressive accomplishment, Rick. Chatham's achievements set examples to continue to inspire others. A legacy remains with us on the page and on canvas, and it's all captured in his soulful book, Dark Waters. The story, The Great Duck Misunderstanding, is a classic about which writer John Gierach said, "I've met half a dozen duck hunters who pored over The Great Duck Misunderstanding," a great title, "as if it were the Dead Sea Scrolls, trying to piece together Russ's duck recipe." Lea and I, my wife, we have a copy, and it's stained with grease and wine. Actually, you can barely read the story anymore. It was in that story that he revealed what I think were his true feelings about ducks and blood sports in general, saying, "Most people get it wrong, and so you learn not to talk about it." Back in 2019, I knew he wasn't well. But when I heard of his passing on November 10th, on a cold, raw evening, I was heartsick. I poured myself a stiff cocktail. I went into my basement and recalled that first meeting in Key West, a photographer encountering legends. In front of an old glass-fronted bookcase, I located his anthology, Silent Seasons. I thumbed to the last story he wrote, Seasons Then and Now, and I took a long drink, feeling rotten. I began to read a passage I'd read several times before. It made me feel his presence come lifelike into the room. The canyon is so deep here that with the darkened sky, it is like being in a cathedral. The light is dull, and you keep coming back to the mossy cliff, which seems illuminated. For me, this is a gallery of spirits, though now they are less real than ever before. I look at the river steadily for perhaps a full minute, and my mind expands that 60 seconds into a century, a millennium. In my limited way of seeing things and sensing things, I feel this will go on forever. Thank you.
So before I hand it over to a person who I also think is a brilliant writer, I think I read 9 Mile Wolves in a day. I'm pretty sure we read Winter in book club, but I might also have read that in a day. If you haven't read them, you absolutely should. I am just going to say, or tell, a very brief story. We've been talking a lot about this balance between being a writer and an artist, and kind of going back and forth between the two, and maybe trying to figure out which one he was. And when my dad came up here in 1971 in the fall to visit Tom and to look at maybe renting a place here, Tom said, well, there's a place that might be for rent up at the end of Deep Creek, and I'll introduce you to the guy. So the guy he introduced him to was a man named Don Mell, who was a real estate developer in Bozeman and Livingston, but who bought an entire section of land at the end of Deep Creek to preserve it forever for his family. And my dad went to meet with him and said, I hear you have the house that's on the property is for rent. And Don said, yeah, what do you do? And my dad said, well, I'm a sports writer. I write for like Sports Illustrated and Esquire. And Don said, oh, well, I guess that'll have to do, but I was really hoping to rent the house to an artist. To which he said, I'm really an artist. So, there's that. So I am thrilled to be able to say that we have Rick Bass with us, and he's going to come up and share a little bit as well. And again, I think they had a long relationship where, that was around literature and books. Dad was thrilled to be able to publish 9 Mile Wolves. And part of the reason why I sort of devoured the book so fast was because you guys, Liz and Dad, had gone when they released the wolves in the park. They'd been invited to be in like the small group of people who could be there and watch them be released from their cages to set out into the wild. And there was a photographer there who took all these amazing pictures, which I stole and kept forever and never gave back. So I'm thrilled to introduce Rick Bass.
Leah's wine out. It was white, I believe.
It was birthday, but you finished with a towel.
If we can get, thank you, Mark. Already on.
Not very much, but I know it's
Elk River, thank you guys for putting this together, and Leah and Steve and Stephen for sharing the stories about this dear friend we've lost. Thanks for asking for the show of hands. And it is like we know the painter he was, we know the writer he was, but one day the last person who ever knew him will no longer be living, and they'll just be paintings and books. And it's really important to Montana and to art and to what we call the Republic that the person he was be remembered. And even if you didn't know him, if you knew somebody who did, it's enough. It's as if you did. We share strands of DNA in non-sexual transfer. I mean, trees in a forest will exchange packets of DNA, and we change species in our lives. Our DNA is not what we came into the world with, and we will leave with more of Russ after this evening from these stories and testimonies. I love that part, Stephen, about him never kissing anybody's ass. That was such a wonderful thing to see. He took it further than that. He would go out of his way to run over people. It wasn't just about not kissing their ass. He would go to war. And he was not afraid to be uncommercial. That was a huge value to so many writers of my generation. Yeah, do little fine arts books if you believe in a subject. He said, I'll do a painting if you'll do an essay about wolves. I said, that's a heck of a deal. And the difference between going into Callender Street office, Clark City, with Jamie and the crew instead of being in New York was, life-giving. He was generous. I think that's come through. He was generous with his mind. He would start talking to you about anything, font or recipes or striped gas or design, as if you knew something. He was just so generous. Thinking about him, Jim Harrison had an epigraph to one of his books ascribe to an old saying. I think Jim may have made up old sayings that he just thought sounded good and he would use them for an epigram, but this one was really eloquent. It said, "We love the world but could not stay." Or maybe he said Wallace Stevens said, I can't remember, but I think it was Jim. But I think about that a lot with Russell. As much as he loved the world, he could not stay. And I think we're hearing it could not have been easy to be him, but it was really easy to be his friend. And we're in his debt. I want to read a poem that makes me think of his. We've heard about his passion and we've heard about his talent, but I don't know of another artist who had as much passion and as much talent. And there's a poet named John Berryman that the poet W.S. Merwin wrote about, and I think he could have been writing about Russell. "I will tell you what he told me in the years just after the war, as we then called the Second World War." Can y'all hear me in the back? We can turn the air conditioner off if not. "Don't lose your arrogance yet," he said. "You can do that when you're older. Lose it too soon and you may merely replace it with vanity." Just one time he suggested changing the usual order of the same words in a line of verse. Why point out a thing twice? He suggested I pray to the muse, get down on my knees and pray right there in the corner. And he said he meant it literally. It was in the days before the beard and the drink, but he was deep in tides of his own, through which he sailed, chin sideways and head tilted like attacking a sloop. He was far older than the dates allowed for, much older than I was. He was in his 30s. He snapped down his nose with an accent I think he had affected in England. As for publishing, he advised me to paper my wall with rejection slips. His lips and the bones of his long fingers trembled with the vehemence of his views about poetry. He said the great presence that permitted everything and transmuted it in poetry was passion. Passion was genius, and he praised movement and invention. I had hardly begun to read. I asked, how can you ever be sure that what you write is really any good at all? And he said, you can't. You can't. You can never be sure. You die without knowing whether anything you wrote was any good. If you have to be sure, don't write. The thing, though, is Russell knew that he was great. And to keep his humility and generosity in the presence of that knowledge, we have not ever seen that before. And as Terry said, we won't see it again. Two things I think important to carry with you about Russell. He had an assassin's blind rage toward corporate toxicity, but he also was so sweet. He had this child's sense of outrage against injustice, and it was quite a mix. You never knew which was going to come in the next sentence, but you always left him feeling that you were being reminded of how to be more human. He was always on all the time. I want to read a couple passages that I wrote about him. I did this project where I went around in middle age visiting my mentors, and they were all my literary mentors, and the editor said, well, you can't call Russell a mentor, he's a painter. But what he teaches us as a composer and painter is, again, it's about more than art, it's about humanity. Working from Paradise Valley by the banks of the same river that Bierstadt painted, Chatham painted the gates of the mountains in their natural duality, glaciers on the icy peaks while the valley below was already verdant. He painted the ag lands along the Yellowstone, the homesteads, the solitary cabins with their tiny window square of light at dusk, and the darkness beyond the fields, the big cottonwoods along the wide river. The great artist changes how we see the world. His genius is to see things the way they are and to make us see them that way too. How many times have we heard someone say, beholding a landscape, that it looks just like a Chatham painting? He has a section in Dark Waters where it's kind of an anomalous essay in the book. He's got, you know, the cooking and the painting and the rambling and stuff, but he has a page and a half about, excuse me, a photograph by Edward Curtis of a Kootenai duck hunter, circa 1910. And it's a couple of short pages I want to share because it's him being dead serious and just kind of in that reverie place that we were talking about the cliff. He goes to the other world, the one-eyed world with the great depth perception. And he quotes Luther Standing Bear, the Sioux chief. We did not think of the great open plains, the beautiful rolling hills and winding streams with tangled growth as wild. Only to the white man was nature a wilderness, and only to him was the land infested with wild animals and savage people. To us it was tame. Earth was bountiful, and we were surrounded with the blessings of the great mystery. Not until the hairy man from the east came and with brutal frenzy heaped injustices upon us and the families we loved was it wild for us. When the very animals of the forest began fleeing from his approach, then it was for us that the Wild West began. In Russell's words, there is no more complex and viable record of a culture at peace with the natural world than the volumes of photographs of American Indians by Edward Sheriff Curtis. In his poetic yet powerful Duck Hunter, the figure, much as a Sung Dynasty painting, is an observer rather than an intruder. He is an integral part of the scene, topically and formally, the parts as inseparable from each other as the black and white shapes of the Oriental yin-yang symbol. Curtis saw his subject with the heart and clear eye of the true artist. As a painter and draftsman, as well as a photographer, he attained art's greatest goal. He made his process invisible. Thus, we are able to enter the very lives of his people. Excuse me. Like all art which sticks, the implication of the subject matter is what provides the hard core of the work. There is surely an age-old pocket in the subconscious which triggers sympathetic human response to the unexplainable phenomenon of migrating animals. Perhaps it is simply a kind of proclamation that there is, after all, an order to things. Ducks are one of the many creatures that provoke this sense of wonder and gratitude in us. Curtis has given us the Indian's legacy of spirituality in a form we can see and, much more importantly, feel. If we commit ourselves to learning that man and nature are one sacred entity, we will have gone a long way toward improving our own condition and that of the earth on which we live. I mean, we forget how positive he was, how optimistic and joyful with it. You know, he had the rage and he had the cynicism, and he could call an asshole faster than an asshole's ever been called. But he did believe, obviously he believed in beauty. I mean, he built his life worshiping. Black Elk talks of cycles. Everything the power of the world does is done in a circle. The sky is round, and I've heard that the earth is round like a ball, and so are all the stars. The wind in its greatest power whirls. Birds make their nest in circles, for theirs is the same religion as ours. The sun comes forth and goes down again in a circle. The moon does the same, and both are round. Even the seasons form a great circle in their changing, and always come back again to where they were. The life of a man is a circle from childhood to childhood, and so it is in everything where power moves. Again, I'm really grateful that Elk River, you know, there is so much power from his work in us who knew him and in us who look at his paintings. He was so generous. I have some more words by him, a paragraph in his essay, Letter to a Young Painter. He thought about that a lot. He thought about, you know, okay, I've got this artist gig down, but will anybody else ever be able to follow the path? And I think it worried him that it was a hard journey. And so he wrote this letter to young artists, you know, not yet born. The artist does not simply hold a mirror to society, he has written. If the world now is greedy, the artist must be generous. If there is war and hate, he must be peaceful and loving. If the world is insane, he must offer sanity. And if the world is becoming a void, he must fill it with his soul. You know, still have 4 seasons in Montana. We love it. We've chosen to be here above any other place. we don't like what's happening, and we're not the first in that circle and cycle to not be happy with newcomers. And I have a theory, a hope, a positive hope, that Russell's paintings and the landscape itself will change the newcomers, will change their thinking, and it will be as it always has been. People come here and their hearts are opened or broken or healed or whatever, and they see these mountains and they see these paintings, and they become of the place. And I just think Russell is going to be a really important mediator in that transition from the now to what comes next. And he is here, and he will always be here. Thank you guys for making the space for him tonight. Sorry, Mark and Andrew. It's kind of sticky up here.
All right, I just want to say that Rick stole my thunder because I was going to close with that quote. So instead, I'll close with this. People have said he knew he was great, or he knew he was going to be famous, or he wanted to be famous, or maybe he didn't think he was great. And he did want to be famous. He often talked about wanting to be famous. It was important to him. And he compared himself a lot of times to other people who he felt were more famous than him. And he wondered why he wasn't as famous as they were. And while he did think he was talented, he often tore up paintings that were beautiful and shredded them and threw them away. And he often felt like his paintings were not very good. He didn't want to come when the Museum of the Rockies put his paintings up again, and he asked me to give a speech in his place. And he told me it's because he didn't think they were very good. The only one he liked is the one that no one else likes. Because actually, the paintings he likes the best are the ones he did when he was young, that nobody else really thinks of as being sort of the paintings that represent who he kind of became in his journey to sort of become famous and well known. And I think the same is true of his writing. And that struggle between writing and painting, that reference to him writing a story for Field and Stream when he was a teenager, he also did a duck stamp. His greatest dream in life was that he wanted a duck stamp. And he was rejected over and over again. And he never got one. So I think he often felt like the things he most wanted, that he most tried for, or the things he most liked, or the things he couldn't get, or the things that other people liked, but he didn't like them as much. And he never quite came to a place where what he loved was the same as what somebody else loved, and it all kind of came together. But despite his own kind of frustrations and struggles in that way, he was also the kindest, most generous person. And I can't imagine that there's a person in this room who did not in some way benefit from 40 years of him donating to every single cause in this town, every month, decade after decade, showing up in the bank one day when a family here had lost their husband and father in a fire. And there was like a bucket, put some money in the bucket because we're raising money for this family. And this was not when we had a lot of money. This was, this was when my dad was grifting back in the day. Are any of the bank people here? You can't tell anyone, Joe, because you're his lawyer. There's a confidentiality. But he used to get checks for paintings, and he'd deposit it in one bank, and then he'd withdraw some of the money, and then he'd deposit that in the next bank and withdraw some, to try to keep it rolling forward. Back in the day when it took 10 days for a check to clear. So he went in the bank, and he said he only had maybe $1,000 or $1,500 in his account, and he sees this thing that says, this woman and her 2 or 3 kids now the husband was a firefighter, he died, and the town's trying to raise money, and he's not making any money. says to the teller at the bank, never mind, just empty my account, put it all in the jar. And he did that over and over again. And for all his flaws and all his struggles and all his challenges and all the times that he sent scathing, really inappropriate letters to a number of people, at the end of the day, really, he kind of never got the things he wanted most, and he spent his life trying to give other people the things that they wanted. And that's really what made him so special. So I was going to close with the quote about the artist needs to give the world his soul when the world sucks like it does today, but I can't.